This content is brought to you by Fisher Improvement Technologies Online, a learning platform that includes self-paced courses, knowledge sharing, and networking opportunities for safety, quality, and performance improvement professionals. Join now for free at online.improvewithfit.com.
This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Over 25 years helping leaders reducing errors and incidents. Here is your host of the Essential Leadership Cycle podcast, Rob Fisher.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another round of the Essential Leadership Cycle podcast. I'm your host and intentional leader, Rob Fisher. And today we've got a real treat. I have Dr. Todd Conklin, who to some need no introduction, but to others is a good friend, longtime colleague, probably going on 25 years now, which may be one of the longest relationships in the hop world.
I bet it is that long. I bet you're right. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
And I liked how you started the podcast with the word round.
Thank you.
That's good. I think round people need more respect, is what I think.
I thought it was
going in that direction. Sorry. I took it. I went to a different place.
No, then it would be a big and round.
Falstaffian. That's the word we want to use.
So, Todd, for those that don't know, tell them who you are and why we're here.
So my name is Todd, and I spent a really long time in the Department of Energy working with the Human Performance Program. And Rob and I met, I would have a hard time putting a date on it, a long time ago.
Long time ago.
And fortunately, during those days, we were a small community and we needed each other badly. Where we ask questions like, what does this mean? What do you think James Reason meant when he said this? What's this?
And then we'd ask him.
Yeah, exactly.
It was that long ago.
We'd be completely wrong. No. Oh, he didn't. Oh, well, that's what he thought. So I did that for a long time. And then it just kind of morphed into what I do now, which is just help organizations go on this same voyage that all of us are going on. I mean, that's not that dramatic of an introduction, but that's kind of me.
No, I think that's great. And again, most people that listen to this know who you are. And I don't know that people really know our background together and a lot of the things that we've done over the years. And
oh, yeah.
To me, you've always been that friend that from high school that you get together and it's like we never left.
You just pick back up. I agree with you. I think that's true. I think that's very true. It's fun. Did you think it would go this? I mean, did you ever imagine it would go like this? It would go this long, or we'd still be talking about the same stuff? And
not only did I not think it, when I started the first company, there were people that pulled my wife off to the side and said two things. And we want to tell you this privately because we love you. He's not very good at this. That stuff he's talking about isn't going to last very long. So please, you and your family, don't hitch your wagon to this thing that he's doing. Is there any way we can talk you out of it?
Isn't that funny? That's so funny to me. I don't know. I never imagined it. I'm like you. This is crazy.
But I think one of the reasons why I didn't imagine it is because I think we expected that people would see what we saw so early on. Yeah. And take to it quickly like we did, instead of us having to have some pretty torturous exchanges over the years.
I agree with you. In fact, I think that's exactly right. That I always imagined there'd be a million of us.
Yep.
And that it was just a matter of time, especially in the early days, when people would come along and sort of, we would become a part of a larger and larger and larger and larger group of a cadre of people. I think that's actually true. And in a way, it's interesting to me that it took as long as it took to diffuse. But I think that's a little bit of old man talk on our part, because I think it's diffusing really fast now. We were just really early adopters, or just we were there when everything was really green and it scared people.
Yeah. And I take some personal accountability for maybe I wasn't presenting it the way that people needed to hear it to shift their paradigms back in the day.
So I don't think so. I think you've always been masterful in the way you present the material and masterful in your depth of knowledge. That's never been your problem. Yeah, I'm sure you got other problems. We can talk about that on the non-essential leadership cycle podcast, which is that's the X-rated version that Rob does. I don't know if you guys listen to it, but it's
I don't do an X-rated version as far as
you know. I'm teasing. Yeah, as far as you know. No, I actually think it took a while to diffuse because organizations themselves didn't realize they needed it. If you really want my theory on this, and I have a theory on this, is that I think the prevention bias has probably been what slowed diffusion of these ideas down more than anything else on earth. It's the belief that every accident is preventable. And we really hammered, I mean, not we, but our companies really hammered that message hard.
Yeah.
And if you believe everything is preventable, then you're always going to, when something bad happens, you're always going to think, well, it happened because we failed to prevent it. And that means that all these ideas in human performance aren't as important because we've got to get better at preventing things. That's my theory.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and that ties into, this thing that I'm on right now about leader response matters. In that, we've been out there telling people that, that's not a positive or a negative. Leader response matters, and there's a period there, possibly an exclamation point.
Right, maybe.
But leader response to success matters as much as leader response to failure. And in fact, you have hundreds and thousands of more opportunities to respond well as a leader to the successes or to the things that people do well than you do when people fail.
And that response is a deliberate strategy. I mean, and it's so important, I think. Well, so let me ask one question. Were you surprised that fifth principle changed?
To leader response matters? Or?
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's what it needed to be. I remember back in the days, people were talking about our reaction to failure matters, and
right,
having some pretty good conversations about we got to separate between a reaction and a response and the intentionality behind them.
Right. And I think intentionality is a big deal. To me, what's so interesting is the original 5 principles, the IMPO 5, didn't really talk very much about leadership response. In fact, it didn't talk about it at all.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Well, it kind of does, right? I mean, because in the old days, the principles were really pointed at the workforce, right? And that was still part of the old trap of the workers the problem. And so if we make the workers better, if we make the workers safer, if we make them more obedient or more careful, they'll be safer. And we realized over time that, in fact, directing those principles at the workforce was kind of a mistake. I mean, really, they're not things workers need to do. They're things organizations need to be aware of. And so I thought the move towards talking about this idea of intentional and deliberate response was really pretty profound. And I think in many ways, I mean, I shouldn't say this because this is controversial. I think it's maybe one of the most important of the 5 principles.
Well, I don't know why that's controversial. That's one of the most, if you strip it from HOP, isn't our response one of the most important principles at all?
I mean, I agree with you
in life,
but shouldn't you love all 5 principles equally?
I mean, that's
like your children.
Love all your children and grandchildren. Here. Oh wait, I do.
Hey, the mic's on.
Yes, sorry. Stop record.
But that idea that leadership is a deliberate, intentional act is pretty interesting to think about, because not that people don't think that. I think they think that, but oftentimes organizations act as if events happen to them. And so then leaders almost act like victims. And that is unimpressive to me at every level. It's also, at least in my mind, kind of fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
That in fact, the leader is not the victim of the event. The leader is the person who is sort of guiding the organization in which the event happened.
Right.
And so their response to both positive and negative, to right and wrong, to good and bad, all the things that happen in an organization, those responses are really significant because the behavior that exists in the workplace is a function of the leadership response.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it from a sort of a cultural standpoint, it's a pretty powerful tool.
Well, one of the things that we've been saying for a long time, I mean, decades now, is that in order to move down this road, you have to change three things to get started: leader knowledge, leader language, and leader behaviors. You change those three things, you got a shot. And I think early on, kind of to back something up that you were talking about a little while ago, I think in phase one of human performance, we were just able to get people to buy in that it was a worker thing.
Right.
And so they, they bought in, but if back in that day, we would have tried this holistic approach, I don't think it would have gone very far, because first you had to get people to believe that there was some science and some principles behind this. So I really do think there's for lack of a better term that you might love, a hierarchy of controls for the principles. In other words, if I can't get the leaders to change their knowledge, language, and behaviors, leader response really, really, really matters.
Yeah, I agree.
The other ones are hard to fall into place. It's not, I think the message, it's not the last one.
Right. I mean, that's a good way to say it, because it is the fifth one. I suppose there's an implied notion that it's the last one, but they're all sort of, well, it's interesting because there really is kind of an order, I wouldn't call it a hierarchy, but only just because I wouldn't call it. It's more of a prepotency. Like I remember when we started the journey, everything was about managing worker error. But then we realized at some point pretty early on that it really, if you're going to talk about worker error, you have to first talk about blame. Because blame has this really incipient power to make mistakes choices. And so when you blame somebody for making a mistake, you're saying the mistake is a choice. They should not have made that mistake. Why did they choose to make a mistake? Well, that's not how mistakes work. I mean, we can talk about that later, but that's pretty obvious. What's interesting to me is that the leadership component of this has become really everything. I 100% agree with you. I couldn't be more in agreement with you that the best way to shift an organization and its culture is to shift the language that the leaders use to talk about the work. Right? That's incredibly powerful. And one of the ways to help do that is by giving leaders different information. So if you want different leadership behavior, then give them different data. So instead of talking about all the bad things that happen, talk about the good things that happen. I mean, that's an easy example, but there's lots of ways to look at and really help leaders understand that when something happens, there's that sacred moment, small s, sacred moment, where how they determine their intentional and deliberate response to that moment will set the path for the organization in the future.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we kind of rob some things, no pun intended, obviously, from some of the worker elements in giving leaders some tools of their own to manage that instant where they have to turn their reaction into a response. And, if you're going to ask a worker to say, as we're preparing for this task, what's the worst thing that could happen or what bad things could go wrong? Why wouldn't a leader press their pause button and say, related to my response, what's the worst thing that can happen with this response?
Right. It's a pretty good idea, actually.
And what bad things could go wrong. And what it does is it forces their brain to slow down and allow the intentionality instead of the reaction being instantaneous.
But I think it's that second question that you ask after you press the pause button. The first question is what could go wrong? And then the second question, which I think is the profound question, is okay, when that happens, because we don't have perfect systems, processes, practices, or people, when that thing goes wrong, what's my recovery strategy? How much capacity do I have in this conversation? How much capacity do I have in this system? How much capacity do I have in this work planning, et cetera, et cetera? Those are all important parts of that component. And all of it hinges directly around this idea that what leaders do matters. And that I say this all the time, it's a deliberate, intentional response.
Yeah.
That when something happens, you need to practice. I mean, and I ask that all the time. I was at a meeting earlier, I guess later last week, because today's Monday, where they were talking about fatalities. And the last question I asked the group is, something bad will happen again, because it will. What's your leadership strategy for when it happens now? And of course, the room was super quiet because nobody wants to have that conversation. But those are conversations you can have before the event. And those are decisions you can make for how you're going to intentionally and deliberately respond to whatever that failure looks like. In many ways, Rob, I think the pandemic has helped us. It's changed the conversations we have with leaders, because leaders now understand something that they pretended to kind of understand earlier. So I think pre-pandemic, leaders really believed that if they did a good job and made a strong strategic plan, stuck to that plan, and kind of kept the compass pointing north, the company would grow, prosper, and flourish. And then the pandemic happened, and they had to deal with the fact that uncertainty is, at the bottom line, uncertain. That's not the smartest thing I've ever said, but right. And that's really helped them understand that what they do as a leader is build capacity in a system for uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that's a decision. I mean, that's a deliberate, intentional act. And that's really important.
It is. We shifted, and it was funny that it happened probably 2 years before the pandemic. We shifted to this intentional leadership set of concepts because we needed to get the leaders bought in that direction. But I think the pandemic took VUCA from being a phrase and a catchy thing to something that people can understand how that impacts the way an organization either thrives or survives or is great.
And the thing about that VUCA, because I think you're right on target. So the VUCA, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, that's VUCA, got that out there. We've talked about that for the last almost 30 years.
Right.
So we know that systems have variability, and that stability is not really stable, and that uncertain events happen. That's what we talk about. And so we've always said, you've got to build capacity in your organization. And when we say capacity, we're talking about controls and barriers and safeguards, but we're also talking about leadership competency. I mean, that's a huge,
absolutely.
That may be more important than controls, barriers, and safeguards. What's amazing to me about that is that I think leaders thought they understood that leadership capacity component until it was tested. And then they realized that they didn't fully understand that leadership capacity component. The crack up to me, and this is the crack up, is I remember even as recently as a couple of years ago, people honestly asking me, what do you mean when you say capacity? And then the pandemic happened, and nobody asks that question anymore. Everybody understands completely what we mean when we said capacity.
I think leaders, and now we're back to knowledge, language, and behaviors, right? I think leaders understood those things to the point that they thought they understood them, but they didn't know them.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
So all these places say they want to be a learning organization. Well, you can't be a learning organization if you don't actually learn. I mean, if you can understand that there's a concept out there, but if you don't know how to use it, that's like saying, well, okay, I took algebra and calculus in high school, but I'll never have to use it. We were having this conversation in my family this weekend that they were trying to understand something. I said, well, why don't you just use the Pythagorean theorem? Just find out how far it is across there. And, of course, one of them looked at me and says, I left algebra and that stuff behind geometry behind in high school. I figured I'd never use it again. I said, well, I use it every day.
A surprise.
So that whole thing about understanding capacity, about understanding intentionality, they weren't using it every day. They had somebody come in and talk to them about it and nodded their heads, say, yeah, that's good stuff. We need to put that in the way we talk. But it wasn't tested in the way it got tested over the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think a part of it was they thought, that's good stuff. Our people need that.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Our people being everyone except maybe
except us, right?
Right.
And you really saw that. I mean, you see it all the time. It's
Still
amazing.
do.
You really see it like when you do a big, horrible investigation, and you'll go in and talk to the senior team or the board of directors, and there's a clear kind of us and them. And one of the things I do, which is not very pleasant, but I do it pretty aggressively, is help them understand that this is your problem. I mean, you a bad thing happened and you're the boss. Yeah. There's no turfing that down the chain. This is your accident. And what are you going to do about it? And that's hard, but I think it helps him understand to a more complete degree the notion of intentionality, of being deliberate, of how they respond matters. It makes a huge difference. I mean, it's at the risk of saying the same crap over and over again, which is pretty much my career. If you look me up on Wikipedia, that idea that what they say and do will set the course for what happens next.
It defines the culture of an organization. Stop talking about culture and start defining what leaders know, say, and do, and you'll have the right culture.
I agree. And what's interesting is that you can help leaders respond by actually giving them information that encourages them to respond. So one of the most interesting experiments is a large company added one question to their kind of event review that went up to the senior leadership team. So they had a little formal kind of process to take near misses and close calls and accidents and injuries and all that kind of crap up to the big boss office. And what they added was they added a line that says, did the safeguard function? Pretty simple little question. And it was yes or no. If yes, they explained how it worked. If no, they explained what was missing. That completely changed what leaders started asking about.
Yeah.
Instead of asking about the presence of risk, they started really getting fixated on the presence of control. And they could understand that event that happened that didn't have a high consequence outcome didn't have a high consequence outcome because the safeguard functioned.
Right.
Had the safeguard not functioned, this would have been really, really, really bad. And what's interesting is that little addition, which was simple, that changed what leaders knew, which then changed how leaders talked, which then ultimately changed what leaders were interested in.
Right. Which changes their behavior.
Right. Totally. Well, behavior is always a function of the sort of the system, right? I mean,
exactly.
Not capital S system, but system.
Right.
So that idea that leadership behavior is a choice is a cute idea. And when we say words like deliberate and intentional, we're probably playing into this idea that if they just cared more and tried harder, they'd be better. But what we mean is that we build systems and give data to each other that deliberately sets leaders up to be successful.
Right.
So instead of telling them this bad thing happened, right, which they'll know because that's not a surprise, we want to really say this is how this bad thing happened.
Yeah, and I've also started reminding these organizations that do possess risk, that when you pull off something that you know is inherently risky, that's tough, that's difficult, it's great to sit down afterwards and say, how did we pull that off?
Right.
What is it that made it successful that we need to make sure we do in other things, similar things in the future? Where did we get close and we got saved by one or two things? But having those discussions over things that we know have risk, that we do well, is the only way to really capture that knowledge, especially when people are leaving left and right.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about this idea of the Great Resignation? And how does that impact leaders and how they respond?
Well, I think a part of it is, I think we have to segregate the sectors that the big resignation is happening in.
Okay. That sounded really smart, but I don't know what you meant by that, but that sounded good.
So,
like you could type that.
But they talk about how many people leaving industry. Well,
Right.
I don't know that we have the same percentage of people resigning from oil and gas technical positions as we do from being a server or a service industry individual.
Right. Well, there seems to be. So I've been trying to study this up a little because I find this really interesting. There seems to be sort of two categories of people that are leaving, and it's the more experienced workers who just aren't coming back.
Right.
So
and they were going to leave eventually anyway.
Yeah, they call them the boomers, which is incredibly offensive. Don't you find that offensive?
Every time until I sit down and I know what you're talking about
and do the math, and you're like, "Oh crap, that's me!" Right? And they were leaving anyway, and they're just not coming back in full speed, which makes sense, right? I mean, I understand that. And then at the other side of the spectrum, not the bottom end, top end, but sort of if you saw it like a bell curve,
right.
The other side of the spectrum is basically saying, I'm not sure this is worth coming back to. I can do better. I can hustle better. I can do multiple jobs and have more control. And so you're seeing this really interesting movement. I actually think between us, and I haven't talked much about this out loud, it's probably a good thing. It's a great recentering. So every pandemic, at least in recent history, in the last 500-600 years, has really brought forth a giant economic change. Right. So the Black Plague really brought together the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
I mean, we can sort of look at that. I think you're seeing a recentering of what work looks like, which of course is going to have dramatic impact on how leaders lead. And part of what I think is so significant with like the VUCA framework is that one of the things VUCA says is that diversity of opinion is more vital now than it's ever been before. And leaders who insulate themselves and don't talk a lot to their workforce, don't ask questions like what's happening when nothing bad's happening or how did we succeed in this, tend to be less successful in this current culture. And so now there's a big push, or maybe I should there needs to be a big push. I'm not sure the push has happened yet, to really build data collection processes to leadership teams that are from diverse areas of the organization. So suddenly the voice of the worker has a much different feel to it because of the Great Resignation idea. So if people are leaving, the first thing the boss has to say is, well, help me understand what's going on there, what's happening, and what's our strategy to actually build recoverability. How are we going to micro experiment solutions? How are we going to make quick decisions knowing we can change those decisions? Those are all the things that come out of the VUCA framework that I think have really made leadership do some things that they haven't done before.
Well, and to go back and answer part of your question, I think that leader engagement, not observation, but leader engagement has now become more important than ever. Because you'll find those things out.
Observation was just dumb. I mean, I think we can just say going out and observing work is just dumb. And to a great extent, the notion of management by walking around is dumb. What we really want is engaged leaders talking to the workforce. Now, maybe that's what they meant by walking
Well,
around.
that was what they were trying to say without saying it and without doing it. People used to laugh and then tilt their heads like a cow looking at a new gate. When I would say, so let's talk about management by stumbling through.
Yeah, that's better.
No, we do management by walking around. So, well, what do you do when you walk around? How have the leaders been taught to engage the workforce in a way that you get information? So we started teaching leaders how to do what we call values-based engagements. When you go out and you talk to people, you have to talk about values. Your questions are about values. They're open-ended. You're trying to find matches and mismatches and those things that show gaps in the way people think in the organization at all the different levels, that diversity of input. And in fact, one of our clients, the CEO, demands that all of his leaders give them the best thing they learned last week in a values-based engagement. And he asks them every Friday. So it drives the leaders out to do something other than watch work, because our one rule is to do a values-based engagement, you can't be watching work. You have to be having a conversation with someone.
How do you get them to be comfortable with the fact that in order to have an effective values-based engagement, you have to not know? That's what I struggle with is I tell leaders this all the time, but I don't think it sticks.
Yeah.
As a leader, it's better to not know the answer than to know the answer. And the reason it's better to not know the answer is because if you don't know the answer, that gives you total permission to go out and get the solution. I mean, you can go out and talk to people. You can go out and ask questions. You can go out and learn.
Well,
right?
It doesn't bias the way you hear the answer either.
Right. If you go out thinking you already know the answer, then it's pretty much a done deal that you're not going to go out to learn. You're going to go out to sort of confirmation bias yourself back into your office. So you're going to go out and look for what you think you're going to see. And as soon as you see it, then you now have permission to go back and type on your computer or whatever. Boss. What do bosses do in those offices?
So I mean,
do they make coffee with Nespresso? What do bosses do in those offices?
Yeah. They have an open door policy. I took my door off so that we can engage loudly and everyone in the cubicles can hear. I have a no door policy.
That's right. I'm doorless.
So you asked a question about how do you get leaders to do that? I think that again, this is part of our engagement with leaders to try and take them on a journey to shift a little bit of their paradigm. But almost all leaders have been in an organization where they were surprised by the outcome of some kind of safety culture survey or some kind of survey. They were surprised at the trust outcome, or they were surprised at some outcome. So I say, well, if you were surprised by that outcome, I want you to go out and have the conversations. Because you were surprised you didn't know, have the conversations from those perspectives. Values-based engagement aren't how's the wife and kids, how's the significant other and your babies. I know everyone in the workforce. Let's talk about the way we think and feel about things. Let's talk about how we support what you need. And don't pretend that you know the answer to that, because if you knew the answer, you wouldn't have been out doing observations before, and you see that those didn't work.
So how do you get them to understand the difference between seeking deviation and learning?
Well, I think that in the beginning, again, we've and you and I have had these conversations before. Our job involves more of the taking them on the journey than to giving them that there's another paradigm out there. You need to start thinking this way. So more of the hows and what's than really what's out there. So we have to teach them about those elements. If you want them to avoid talking about somebody violating a rule, you've got to start segregating what those things are. And then they've got to buy into the segregation. And once they buy into this segregation, that people aren't just out there violating the rules, and you can get them into the probabilities, then they'll start believing that every conversation they have isn't about a deviation or a violation. It's about the way work is done. So they really glom on to that when you take them on that journey. And I've also seen, if you don't take them on that journey, it's hard to pull them off of that ride, because that's where the blame element ties itself to many of our problems. Is Todd violated one of the rules? Cardinal rule, crystal rule, rule of life, rule of thumb, rule of
life-saving rule.
Yeah. Which, and look, I know I'm a little bit out there on this, but if you want to have life-saving rules or save your life rules, as long as those exist, because they're the body of our learning about what we've learned about this challenge, and that's the way we promote them, that's one thing. But if you say we have life-saving rules, and if you violate them, you're out of here, then that's not going to work. And
they need to change it to life-saving controls, right?
I mean, sure,
that's much better. So let me ask a final question, because we're running out of time. Which we knew this would happen, so this isn't that big of a surprise.
Yeah.
What about the fact that leaders will ebb and flow, that there'll always be backsliding, and that's normal, and that there will be moments where they blame and they'll catch themselves and they can recover from it? How do you coach them around this idea of let me say it philosophically? Progress isn't an arc that only moves in one direction. That leadership is always ebbing and flowing. They're always moving towards maturity, away from maturity, towards maturity, away from maturity.
Well, I think we do that in two ways. Number one, when I go talk to leaders, or Ray or one of the folks from our organization goes and talks to leaders, one of the things we tell them is, hey, let's start practicing some of this stuff when you don't have the pressure of the organization to be good at it. In other words, you're the only ones holding each other. Here's our favorite word, accountable to the new way we're talking and the new way we're thinking. And then once the organization is on board and you're moving things, the organization kind of sees it. Understand that somebody should be able to challenge you when you revert to those natural behaviors, because we will. And so I talk about it as a reversion to a natural behavior instead of a slipping like an alcoholic or something like that. I just call it the fact that every now and then we don't manage our tendencies and we revert to those natural behaviors, and we've got to be called on it sometimes. Somebody's got to point it out. We may not even see it. And then you're not starting over. It's not like you got to go back for your one-day chip. It's now we recover from that and we start to move forward with our intentionality again.
Yeah, that's good. This is fun, dude.
It is. It is. Not even it was.
No, it is. It still is. It didn't stop being fun.
That's true. So we have just a couple of minutes. What's one or two things that you just want people to know, Todd, before we close out?
It's not about risk. It's about the ability to have risk. If there was one message I would give leaders, it's to stop believing they can manage uncertainty, because you can't manage uncertainty, because
by its very nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's the definition of it. It's not about the uncertainty. It's about your preparation to have uncertainty. So it's not about risk. It's about the control.
Yeah.
And so every organization has risk: financial risk, political risk, safety risk, environmental risk. There's a million kinds of risks, and they're all critical and they all matter. And a leader manages all those types of risk simultaneously. It's not really about reduction of risk. It's really about the presence of capacity. And that's the big message that I hope comes out of everything we've gone through, because something has to come out of this, because a lot of people have been really pretty seriously impacted by what's taken place in the last couple of years. And if we don't learn from it, then we're just stupid.
Right.
I mean, we're silly.
Well, we
And-
would perpetuate the myth of human stupidity.
Yeah, which we're good at. I mean, because we're human. But that would be the key message I would give people, is that it's not about the risk, because you don't get to manage uncertainty. Uncertainty's always been here, and it's always uncertain. What you manage is the ability to have uncertainty.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had to say one thing based upon this idea that leadership matters, that would be the one thing I'd say.
Profound and prophetic as usual.
Oh, thank you.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you.
So fun, sir.
Thank you.
Well, listen, Todd, it's been fantastic having you on. I'm sure that people are going to want us to do something like this again, and we'll commit to spending more time together. Again, thanks for joining us on the Intentional Leadership Cycle podcast. I'm your host and intentional leader, Rob Fisher. Remember, intentional leadership starts with you.